quilters, Sarah here from Snugglebug Stitching. We are working on our framed Pinwheels quilt along. This is my favorite pattern from Missouri Star Quilt Company. And today starts week 2. So for week 2, we are going to be making half square triangles, and the half square triangles are going to make up the pinwheels in this super cute block. So I do have a more extensive explanation of half square triangles in another video, but for today, we are going to talk about stabilizing those half square triangles. So this pattern calls for 4 at a time half square triangles, and there are a lot of advantages to 4 at a time half square triangles in my opinion. I like that you don't have to draw lines first before you make them, and you don't have to base your seam allowance on a drawn line as opposed to the edge of the fabric. But there are also some things that some people don't like about 4 at a time half square triangles. I've heard some people say that they don't like them because they have a hard time getting them to come out big enough that they can trim them down to the right size. And some of that may have to do with maybe the pattern you were using and how much wiggle room it has in it. This particular pattern, the 4 at a time half square triangles, there is a lot of wiggle room in there, plenty of wiggle room for you to trim those down. And that pattern also allows you to cut all of your pieces for the pattern the same size. So it gives you extra wiggle room and it simplifies your cutting. So that's one reason people have trouble getting them to come out to the right size that they can trim them appropriately. And another reason that a lot of people don't like 4 at a time half square triangles is the bias edges. So what that means is the fabric grain goes horizontally and vertically, and if you cut along that grain, you're not going to have extra stretch in your fabric. But if you cut diagonally, you're not cutting along either of the grains, so there's a lot more stretch in the fabric. And 4 at a time half square triangles end up to where the part that was cut diagonally is on the outside edges of your fabric. So a lot of people have trouble with that, or they don't like that. So one of the things we're going to talk about today is stabilizing those 4 at a time half square triangles. And I said in one of the videos from last week that I would typically starch my fabric before I cut it. I feel like that just makes it easier to work with. But for this particular pattern, since we used layer cake squares, I did not starch my fabric before I cut it. And the reason I did not is because I feel like, for me, it is too easy to distort the shape of the fabric while you are starching it. Now, if you still wanted to do it that way, you still wanted to starch your fabric ahead of time, and that's what works for you, great. You won't really need to pay any attention to what I'm going to show you in this video today. But if you haven't starched your fabric yet, I'm going to show you some ways that you can starch those 4 at a time half square triangles after the fact. So I feel like when I starch layer cake squares, too easy to distort the shape of the layer cake squares. And if I was using a pattern where I was cutting, say, 2 8 by 4 inch pieces, where I had a lot of extra room to play with in that layer cake square, I wouldn't mind. I would do it that way because I still have plenty of room. But with this pattern, you're cutting your 10 inch squares into 4 5 inch squares. There's not extra wiggle room to play with as far as if you distort that shape, you won't be able to get your cuts. So for this video, I'm going to do a quick demo, quickly go through the steps for 4 at a time half square triangles, just so I can show you at what point I'm going to do the things I'm going to do to stabilize them. But there is a more extensive explanation of 4 at a time half square triangles also posted if you want to watch that too. So let's look at how I go about stabilizing these 4 at a time half square triangles. Okay, so we have 2 squares of fabric. We're going to stack those right sides together. And once they are stacked right sides together, you will sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance along all edges of the stack. And I've got my stack sewn together here. And I usually use white thread, but I use black thread here so you could see. So we've got a 1/4 inch seam allowance around all sides. And this is the point where we are going to pause, and I'm going to show you a method for stabilizing these. So here we have two possibilities for what we could starch our fabric with. This is some Faultless Heavy Finish Starch. Just get it at the grocery store. And this right here is a solution I made myself. This is just a regular old squirt bottle that I got from Dollar General. And for your mixture here, for every 1 cup of cold water, you add 2 tablespoons of cornstarch. And that is actually going to be a really heavy starch. Just know you do not need to add cornstarch to hot water. It will not dissolve if you add it to hot water. You can add it to cold water, mix it up, and then boil it if you want to. I don't bother doing that. I just pour cold water into my squirt bottle and then add the 2 tablespoons of cornstarch. If it settles, if the cornstarch settles to the bottom, just give it a good shake. And it's going to be like a kind of a milky look to it because there's so much starch in it. And then we're going to grab the stack that we just sewed together. So I have 2 stacks of fabric that I have sewn a 1/4 inch seam around all 4 edges here. If I was making these in real time, I would just lay out as many of these as I could fit onto my ironing surface. But we're going to do one of these with my mixture that I made myself and one with my starch. So first up, I've got my mixture I made myself. I'm going to squirt this down on one side, and I'm just going to kind of do that to make it even out the starch where I didn't spray it on so evenly. Flip it over and squirt down the other side. And that's a lot of starch, but you're trying to stabilize bias edges there. So the other one, I'm going to use my Faultless Heavy Finish Spray Starch. So same thing, spray down both sides and flip it over. I'm gonna let this sit for a few minutes to kind of let that starch soak in. And then we're going to press these, or more like gently iron these, until the starch dries the rest of the way. Now, since they are sewn together, that stitch around the edge, that 1/4 inch seam allowance around the edge, is going to kind of stabilize that so that we don't distort it like I would have done if I'd have done this to the layer cake squares. All right, so now it's time to use our iron. And we are ironing gently, but I'm not going the slow way and press. And look, that's not even dry, so I have to hold it on there longer. I feel like that takes forever, and it's not something I'm going to want to do. So just ironing that until it dries. And then same thing on the other one. So yes, I'm ironing and not pressing, but I'm not wiggling my iron much. But that seam allowance around the edges does provide some protection from distorting that seam. So once we have one side ironed, we're going to flip both of them over and do the other side. It won't take us nearly as long to dry the other side because it already dried a little bit while we're doing the front side. You see that one's already dry. This one just has a few places that are still wet. Oh, I accidentally hit my steam button. So you don't have to use steam while you are starching because the starch provides you with plenty of moisture for that. So Got these two starched and ready to go, and I'll go back and show you the next step in half square triangles. And I have one more method I want to show you that will happen after we cut these into 4 pieces. Okay, so these are both starched nice and stiff. The next thing we're going to do is cut these into 4 pieces. All right, now they are all cut into 4 pieces. And the next method I'm going to show you will actually happen right now. So you would just starch these right now. So you can see in this video that's popping up, you can see me using that same starch mixture, but instead of in a spray can, in a bowl. And I am dunking these half square triangles in that starch mixture and kind of setting them to the side to let them dry. Now this method works great, but it's pretty messy. So let them dry for a little bit, and then you will grab your iron, press, set the seam, and then open it up and press your half square triangle. And that method works great, but like I said, it's messy. But it's going to give you with the result that has your half square triangle completely unfazed by the biased edges. So the biased edges will not come into play at all, because this will have them ending up like thin cardstock. And I did use that method for the cover quilt for my Doubling Fancy pattern. You can see that picture popping up here. And as far as the methods where I starched them at this stage, at the stacked and seam allowance stage, I used one type of starch for each of these 2 blocks, and I don't even remember which one is which at this point. And as you can see, they both turned out great. So that's one method for squaring half square triangles. Once you get your half square triangles cut into 4s like these right here, you'll just open that up, and then I like to press towards the darker fabric. But I do have a more extensive explanation for making the half square triangles in another video, so you can check that out if you want to. And next week during the quilt along, we will be working on trimming our half square triangles, and then after that, that's the last of the what I would think of as the super tedious part, and we can move on to making some pinwheels.